Get her out of here. She's not even on the official roster. The senior doctor's voice boomed across the crowded emergency room. Emily Carter was pushed aside in front of everyone. A patient lay critical on the bed, the monitor shrieking with a frantic alarm, but no one allowed her to touch him. "Don't make this worse," another resident hissed coldly. Emily stood frozen, her hands clenched, but she didn't fight back. Suddenly, the hospital's heavy doors burst open. The sound of a helicopter shook the entire roof. A SEAL team stormed in, their eyes scanning the room. Where is she? And at that moment, everyone realized they had fired the wrong person. Emily Carter was 27 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen 1,000 lifetimes in a single decade. She had recently joined the Metropolitan Hospital as a float nurse, a temporary staff member meant to fill the gaps in understaffed departments. To the hospital administration, she was just a line on a budget sheet. To the senior doctors, she was practically invisible. Emily didn't have a glittering resume on file in the Human Resources office. She didn't come from a prestigious Ivy League nursing school, and she didn't spend her breaks networking with the influential surgeons in the cafeteria. Instead, she took the shifts no one else wanted. She worked the grueling graveyard hours when the coffee was cold and the trauma cases were messy. She cared for the difficult patients, the ones who were angry at the world, the ones forgotten by their families, or the ones too far gone for the other nurses to bother with. She dressed simply, her scrubs always clean but slightly faded. She spoke softly, yet her voice had a resonance that suggested she was used to being heard over loud noises. But her hands were the real story. They were steady. Even when the sirens wailed like banshees and the chaos of the emergency room threatened to swallow the staff whole, Emily remained a pillar of unnatural calm. She moved with a silent, economical grace that indicated a deep, muscle memory level of high-intensity training. One Tuesday night, the ER was a literal battlefield. A massive multi-car pileup on the icy interstate had sent a wave of critical patients screaming through the double doors. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, blood, and fear. Among the casualties was a man in his 50s, his chest crushed by a steering column, suffering from severe internal bleeding and early-stage hemorrhagic shock. Emily was the first to reach his side. She didn't wait for the digital readouts to stabilize. She noticed the subtle graying of his earlobes and the specific, rhythmic way his neck muscles were straining, signs of a collapsing circulatory system that wasn't yet reflecting on the electronic monitors. She knew the window of survival was closing in seconds, not minutes. "He's going into obstructive shock," Emily said firmly to Dr. Miller, the attending physician who was struggling to intubate another patient nearby. "We need to decompress the left side of the chest before we start the central line, or he won't make it to the OR." Dr. Miller, a man who valued the hospital hierarchy more than his own stethoscope, didn't even bother to look at her face. "He's losing blood, nurse. We focus on the volume and the fluids. Now get back to the supply cart and bring me more units of O negative. Stop pretending you're an MD. Doctor, his vitals are a lag indicator. His heart is fighting a pressure gradient it can't win. If we wait for the monitor to catch up, he'll be in full cardiac arrest in 60 seconds, Emily warned, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of command. Miller snapped. He was tired, he was stressed, and he absolutely did not like being challenged by an extra who wasn't even on his permanent team. He stepped into her personal space, his face turning a deep, angry red. "I told you to get back. You aren't even a permanent hire here. You're a placeholder. Stay in your place or get out of my ER right now." Before Emily could respond or explain the physiology she was witnessing, a security guard, acting on a sharp nod from Miller, grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the exit. The other nurses looked away, some out of fear for their own jobs, others because they were too busy to care about a girl who wouldn't just follow the rules. Emily was escorted to the quiet, sterile lobby. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She stood by the large glass doors, looking back at the trauma bay through the windows. Through the glass, she saw exactly what she predicted. The man's monitor suddenly flatlined. She saw Dr. Miller begin a frantic chest compression that she knew would never work without relieving the pressure. She saw the panicked faces of the residents. She was helpless, discarded like trash by a system that prized ego over observation, despite knowing exactly how to save the life slipping away just 30 feet from her. The silence of the lobby felt like a grave. She felt the old, familiar sting of being the most capable person in the room while being treated like a ghost. Then the vibration started. It began as a low, bone-deep hum in the floorboards. Then a thunderous roar that rattled the massive glass windows of the hospital entrance. The hospital's helipad, usually reserved for civilian medevacs, was suddenly occupied by a massive, matte black military transport bird that carried no markings. The air outside the glass doors turned into a violent cyclone of dust in blinding spotlights. Emily straightened her posture, her shoulders squaring and her gaze sharpening. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a world she had tried to leave behind, now coming to find her in the middle of her darkest hour. If you have ever seen a skilled person ignored just because they were humble, unjust, the hospital lobby erupted in pure confusion. Patients in the waiting area stood up, shielding their eyes from the blinding, high-intensity spotlights of the helicopter hovering just outside. Hospital security scrambled, completely unsure of how to react to an unauthorized military landing that ignored every civilian protocol. The automatic sliding doors hissed open with a sense of urgency, and 5 men in full tactical gear marched in. They were covered in the fine gray dust of the field, their faces grim and unyielding. They carried their gear with the casual familiarity of men who lived in combat. And leading them was a man with gray-streaked hair, a jaw made of granite, and the unmistakable aura of absolute command. Dr. Miller, having temporarily stepped away from his failing patient in a moment of frustration, hurried toward the newcomers, trying to reassert his authority. "This is a restricted medical area. You can't just land a military bird here without clearance. Who is in charge?" The commander didn't stop. He didn't even slow his pace. He looked Miller in the eye with a predatory gaze that made the doctor physically stumble back. The commander didn't care about hospital rules. He cared about survival. "Where is she?" the commander barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Who?" Miller stammered, looking around at the sea of staff. "We have dozens of nurses and doctors on duty." "The nurse," the commander interrupted, his voice like gravel hitting metal. "The one you just removed, Emily Carter. We need her. Now." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Every head in the lobby turned toward Emily, who was still standing near the security desk, her arms crossed. She looked at the commander. A flicker of deep, mutual recognition passed between them. A silent understanding shared only by those who have lived in the dark and fought in the shadows. "Emily?" the commander said, his voice softening just a fraction, revealing a hint of desperation. "Jackson is down. We've tried every field protocol in the book. The transport doc can't stabilize the arterial nick. He's bleeding out from the inside." Emily didn't ask a single question. She didn't ask for permission from the administrators or an apology from Dr. Miller. She reached over the security desk, grabbed a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears from a nearby station, and ran toward the stretcher the SEALs were carrying in behind their leader. A young man, barely 24 years old, was strapped to the backboard. His face was the color of cold marble. His tactical vest was soaked through with dark venous blood. The civilian medics in the room froze. They had never seen a wound like this outside of a specialized military textbook. "Bring him to Trauma 3. Get the lights on and clear the corridor," Emily commanded. "Doctor." Miller tried to step in once more, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Wait, she's not an authorized lead. This is a massive liability for the hospital. We need a surgical team." The commander turned on Miller, placing a single hand on the doctor's chest. It wasn't a push, but it was an immovable wall. "She is the most authorized person in this entire building. If you get in her way again, I will have my men remove you from this facility in zip ties for interfering with a federal operation. Do you understand me, doctor?" Emily ignored the drama behind her. She was already over the patient, her fingers moving with lightning speed. She barked orders at the residents who were standing nearby, orders that were so precise, so technically advanced, and so authoritative that they obeyed her without a second thought. "I need a vascular repair kit, 4 units of O negative on a rapid infuser, and a manual bypass clamp. Now, move. As she worked, the hospital staff watched in stunned, breathless silence. Emily wasn't just a float nurse anymore. She was a surgeon of the shadows. She used techniques that weren't taught in any civilian nursing school. Battlefield maneuvers designed to buy precious minutes when the world was ending in a muddy trench. One of the SEALs, a man with a jagged scar on his jaw and eyes that had seen too much, watched her hands move. He looked at his teammates and nodded slowly. He knew those hands. He had seen them in a mud-filled trench in a country that didn't even exist on most civilian maps. The mystery of just an extra nurse was beginning to unravel in real time. Emily Carter wasn't a placeholder. She was the secret weapon the hospital had accidentally tried to throw away. She was the only person in the city who could save the life of a warrior who had been given up for dead. If you've ever realized you completely misjudged someone, I was wrong. The air in Trauma Bay 3 was thick with the metallic smell of iron and the salty scent of sweat. Emily was deep in the patient's wound, her fingers working with a terrifying mechanical speed. Dr. Miller stood in the back corner of the room, his ego fighting a losing battle against his morbid curiosity. He watched as Emily performed a blind clamp on a hidden pulsing artery, a move so incredibly risky that most board-certified surgeons wouldn't attempt it without a full imaging suite and a team of consultants. "You're going to kill him," Miller shouted, unable to maintain his silence. "You can't see the vessel. You're flying blind." Emily didn't even bother to look up. "I don't need to see it. Doctor, I can feel the pulse and the tension. If I don't clamp this now, his brain is starved of oxygen in 30 seconds. Is that a liability you're comfortable explaining to his father?" Miller went silent, his mouth hanging open. The monitor suddenly began to beep. Not the frantic, high-pitched scream of a dying heart, but the steady, rhythmic, and beautiful thud of a stabilized life. Emily leaned back, her forehead covered in beads of sweat, her blue scrubs now stained a deep, dark red. The young SEAL, Jackson, took a shallow, wheezing breath. His eyes fluttered. The color was slowly returning to his lips. The commander stepped forward into the light of the trauma bay. He looked at the monitor, then at Emily. For the first time that night, the granite mask of his face cracked, and he smiled. It was a tired and profoundly grateful smile. He reached out and placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. Then he did something that stopped the hearts of every civilian in the room. The commander, a highly decorated special operations officer with more medals than Miller had degrees, snapped his heels together and gave Emily a crisp, formal military salute. The 4 other SEALs in the room followed suit immediately, standing at a rigid, perfect attention. The hospital staff gasped in unison. They had never seen anything like it. Nurses stopped in the hallway and orderlies stared through the glass. "What is going on here?" the chief of medicine asked, having just rushed into the room after being woken up by the security alarms. "Who exactly is this woman?" The commander turned to the chief, his voice echoing with a fierce, protective pride. "This woman is Sergeant Emily Mitchell Carter. She was the primary combat medic for my unit for 3 tours of duty in the most hostile territory on this planet. She is a recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action and a 3-time Purple Heart veteran." The commander continued, his eyes scanning the shocked, pale faces of the hospital doctors. 5 years ago, in a valley behind enemy lines, our unit was ambushed. Our helicopter was shot down by an RPG. We were surrounded and outgunned. Emily didn't just patch us up. She carried 3 of my men, including me, across 2 miles of mountainous terrain while under heavy fire. She performed a field surgery in a lightless cave with nothing but a pocket knife and a handheld flashlight. She saved my entire team from a mass casualty event. The commander then looked down at the young man on the bed, his voice trembling for the first time. "And today, she saved Jackson. Jackson isn't just my soldier. He is my son. I brought him here because I heard Emily was working in this city. I didn't care about your hospital's reputation or your fancy equipment. I only cared that she was inside these walls. Because when the world is ending, she is the only one who knows how to fix it." The room went dead silent. The extra nurse was a war hero. The placeholder was a living legend. Dr. Miller felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him as pale as the patient. He remembered pushing her. He remembered calling her a placeholder. He realized that while he was complaining about rosters and administrative paperwork, he had been standing in the presence of someone who had faced death 1,000 times and won. One of the SEALs stepped toward Emily. He was the man she had carried through the mountains 5 years ago. He took her small, blood-stained hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We've been looking for you for 2 years, Em. After you left the service, you just vanished. We wanted to say thank you." Emily offered a small, tired but genuine smile. "I just wanted to be a normal nurse, Leo. I wanted to save people where there wasn't a war going on." "Emily," the commander said, his voice firm and resonant, "you can try to be normal. You can try to hide in the roster, but you can't hide what you are. You're a lifesaver. That's your nature, and the world will always find a way to need you." The chief of medicine stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and apology. "Nurse Carter, Emily, I don't even know what to say. We had no idea of your background. Your personnel file was heavily redacted by the Department of Defense. It just said prior military service. Because she doesn't brag about the lives she's held together with her bare hands," the commander snapped, glancing at Dr. Miller, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor tiles. "She just does the job. Unlike some people in this room who are more worried about who is on the roster than who is on the table." The justice was late, but it was absolute. Emily Carter wasn't just an extra on the roster anymore. She was the only reason the roster still had a pulse. If you've ever owed a debt of gratitude to someone who worked in the shadows, I am indebted. The news of what had occurred in Trauma Bay 3 spread through the sprawling hospital like a wildfire in a dry forest. Within an hour, every nurse, janitor, security guard, and senior surgeon knew the story of Emily Carter. The extra who had been fired and humiliated was now the most respected and feared person in the entire building. The atmosphere in the emergency room changed instantly. The arrogance that usually hung in the air like a thick, toxic fog had cleared. The senior staff moved with more care, double-checking their work. The residents spoke in hushed, respectful tones. They had all been reminded of a fundamental truth. You never truly know the history of the person standing next to you in a blue scrub top. Emily sat in the small, dim break room, a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee cradled in her hands. She was exhausted to her bones, but her eyes were peaceful. She wasn't thinking about the military salute or the medals mentioned by the commander. She was thinking about Jackson, who was now in the ICU, stable and beginning his long road to recovery. She was thinking about the life she had saved, not the reputation she had gained. A shadow fell over the table. She looked up and saw Dr. Miller. He didn't look like the arrogant, untouchable attending physician from earlier that evening. He looked small. He looked humbled. His expensive white coat was wrinkled, and he stood there for a long time with his hands buried deep in his pockets, unable to meet her eyes. "Emily," he began, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he usually hid. I came to apologize, not because of the commander, not because of the SEALs and their medals, but because I was a bad doctor today. I failed the most basic part of my oath." He sat down slowly across from her, looking at the floor. "I allowed my own ego and my obsession with the official way of doing things to blind me to the truth. I almost killed a man tonight because I was too proud to listen to someone I thought was below me on the chart. I don't deserve this coat, and I certainly don't deserve to lead this ER." Emily looked at him. She saw the genuine, raw pain in his face. In the military, she had learned that the most dangerous enemy on any battlefield isn't the one holding a gun. It's the pride that keeps you from seeing the reality of a situation until it's too late. "The patient is alive, Dr. Miller," Emily said softly, her voice lacking any trace of spite. "That's the only thing that matters in this building. Use this feeling. Next time, don't look at the color of the badge or the title on the roster. Look at the patient. Listen to the room. Sometimes the quietest voice has the loudest truth." Miller nodded slowly, a look of profound realization crossing his face. He stood up and did something no one in the hospital expected. He bowed his head to her, a gesture of pure professional submission and respect. A few minutes later, another code blue was announced over the hospital intercom. It was an acute heart failure case in the cardiac ward upstairs. Dr. Miller was the first to respond to the call, but as he reached the swinging doors of the ER, he stopped. He turned back to the nursing station and looked directly at Emily. "Nurse Carter," he asked, his voice clear, steady, and filled with a new kind of respect. "I could really use your eyes and your hands on this one. Would you come with me?" Emily smiled, a small, tired, but hopeful smile. She stood up, straightened her blood-stained scrubs, and followed him toward the elevator. The rigid hierarchy was gone. The toxic ego was dead. In its place was a team. For the first time in its long history, the hospital was operating the way it was truly meant to, with the understanding that every soul in the building, from the janitor to the chief surgeon, was a vital part of the life-saving machine. Emily didn't need to be in the spotlight or have her name on a plaque. She just needed to be where the help was needed most. If you believe that admitting a mistake is the first step to becoming a better person, I will be kind. A full week had passed since the night the world changed at the hospital. The matte black helicopter was long gone, and the sirens had returned to their usual predictable rhythm. Jackson was sitting up in his bed in the recovery wing, already joking with the nurses about the hospital food. His father, the commander, visited every single day, often bringing coffee for the night staff. Emily was back on the night shift. The hospital board of directors had met in an emergency session and offered her a promotion to head of nursing with a corner office and a private assistant. They offered her a massive salary increase in her own parking spot. Emily had thanked them politely, but she had turned it all down without a second of hesitation. "I'm a nurse," she had told the board members. "I belong on the floor. I belong in the trenches where the people are hurting and the minutes matter. I don't belong behind a desk." She continued to work the shifts that no one else wanted. She continued to care for the difficult and forgotten patients. But things were fundamentally different now. When Emily Carter walked into a room, the air changed. When she spoke, the room went quiet. When she made a medical suggestion, the surgeons stopped their work to listen. She had earned a rank that didn't appear on any official roster. One evening, as her long shift was coming to an end, Emily saw the commander sitting in the lobby. He wasn't in his tactical gear this time. He was in a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but he still looked like a mountain. He was waiting for her. "Jackson is being discharged tomorrow morning," he said, standing up to greet her with a warm smile. "He insisted on seeing you before we head back to the base. He said he has a debt to settle." Emily walked with him to the room. Jackson looked healthy, his color was back, and his eyes were bright with a youthful energy. He looked at Emily and tried to find the words, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching out to shake her hand. "My dad told me what you did, not just here in this hospital, but years ago in the valley. I realize I'm alive twice because of you. I'll never forget that." Emily patted his hand gently. "Don't worry about the debt, Jackson. Just pay it forward. Be the man your father thinks you are, and keep looking out for your team." As Emily walked out of the hospital that morning, the sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, painting the clouds in shades of gold and purple. She felt the warmth on her face for the first time in days. She felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. She didn't have a fancy title. She didn't have a spotlight. She was just Emily. The world often judges people by their position, the brand of their clothes, or the size of their paycheck. We ignore the quiet ones. We overlook the humble ones. We fire the ones we think are extra or redundant. But the truth is, the most extraordinary people are usually the ones who don't feel the need to tell you how extraordinary they are. They are the ones who show up when it's dark. They are the ones who stay and fight when everyone else leaves. They are the ones who carry the world on their shoulders without ever asking for a thank you. Emily Carter went home, slept for a few hours, and then got ready for her next shift. Because to her, the medals and the salutes didn't change the reality of the work. The mission remained the same. The real hero wasn't the one in the tactical gear or the one with the loudest voice. The hero was the one in the faded blue scrubs, carrying a tray of medicine, a steady hand, and a heart full of unbreakable courage. Don't ever judge a person by their rank, their silence, or their place on a roster. True strength doesn't need to shout to be felt. It simply acts. The person you think is unimportant or extra might be the only one who knows the way out of the dark when the world falls apart. Arrogance is the greatest poison to progress, while humility is the greatest tool for survival. Always listen, always respect. Because one day you might be the one lying on the bed, and the person you pushed aside might be the only one who can bring you back to the light. If you believe that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their position or status, comment, respect, and don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories for more powerful, true, and inspiring stories about the silent heroes who walk among us every day. Thank you for watching, and remember to look closer.